Dale Pickett started laughing before the county clerk even finished reading the parcel number. It wasn't a discreet laugh, the kind a person tries to suppress in a public room. It was the kind that fills a space, designed to be heard, and every person in that conference room at the Cullen County Courthouse heard it. The 12 farmers, the 2 real estate brokers in the back corner, the elderly woman who'd come to bid on a half-acre lot behind the old feed mill, all of them heard Dale Pickett laugh. The woman sitting in the 3rd row did not turn around. Her name was Wren Ackley. She was 29 years old, and she had a white envelope on her lap that held $2,400 in mixed bills, the last of what remained after the divorce was finalized, after she'd paid 2 months of storage on the furniture she couldn't keep, after she'd bought a bus ticket from Knoxville, back to Cullen County, where she'd grown up and where her father had died 6 months earlier and left her nothing except a name that people here associated with a particular kind of hard luck. When Dale Pickett said, loud enough that the woman in the front row covered her ear with one hand, "Lord, that's Russ Ackley's girl. Somebody stop her before she makes his mistakes twice." Wren kept both hands flat on the envelope and her eyes on the auctioneer. She bid her $2,400. She won. When the gavel came down, the silence in that room was different from any silence she'd heard in it before. She stood, walked to the clerk's table, and handed over the envelope without looking at anyone. If you've ever watched someone do something that looked completely wrong from the outside and found yourself wondering, quietly, privately, whether they knew something everyone else had missed, then you already understand why this story matters. Wren Ackley's father, Russell Ackley, had spent 31 years working as a field assistant for a land surveying company out of Bristol. He was not a rich man. He was not a networked man. He had rented the same house on Barrow Road for most of his adult life and had died owing the county $800 in back taxes on a small woodlot he'd bought 20 years ago and never developed. He had not left Wren money. He had not left her land. He had left her a blue surveyor's notebook filled with his handwriting and a working knowledge of what lies beneath the surface of the ground in Cullen County that very few people still living possessed. The parcel she'd bought at the tax sale, 41 acres in the county's northeast corner, accessed by an unmaintained gravel road off Route 17, had not been farmed in 40 years. The previous owner had inherited it from an uncle, looked at it once, and let the taxes lapse for 6 years before the county moved to take it. What grew on it, wall to wall across all 41 acres, was kudzu, the invasive vine that eats everything it touches: fence posts, tree canopies, entire hillsides. Dense, ropey, pale-stemmed kudzu that had covered the old shale quarry cuts and the cedar stands and the 2 creek draws so thoroughly that nothing was visible beneath it except more kudzu. Everyone in Cullen County knew what was growing on that parcel. That was why nobody had bid. What Wren knew, and what her father's notebook confirmed, was that beneath the kudzu, beneath the old quarry cuts, and the shale outcroppings and the ridgeline, the northeast corner of Cullen County sat above one of the clearest perched water tables in the region. The shale beds trapped it. The clay-rich hollows collected it. And her father had written in his notebook, in the plain, careful hand of a man accustomed to precision, that the northeast corner of the Dunbar parcel had a cold water spring, sealed under decades of collapse and growth that nobody had bothered to look for because the land had already been written off. She'd read that notebook 3 weeks after she buried him. She'd been sitting on the floor of her storage unit in Knoxville at the time, going through the last of his things, before she figured out what to do next. She had quit her nursing job 4 months earlier after 5 years in an emergency department, had filed the divorce papers around the same time, and had been existing in the particular suspended state of someone who has removed every external structure from her life simultaneously, and now has to decide what to build instead. She didn't build anything in Knoxville. She called a cousin in Cullen County who told her about the tax sale. The first night she spent on the property, she slept in her car. She didn't have a tent. She had a sleeping bag, a flashlight, and a duffel bag with 4 days of clothes. And she drove up the unmaintained road to where the gravel ended and sat with the engine off, and her window cracked, listening to the kudzu move in the wind, which is its own particular sound, a dry papery rustling that is nothing like trees and nothing like grass, something entirely itself, miles of vine draped over miles of terrain. She was not afraid of the sound. She had worked night shifts in an emergency department for 5 years. The dark was not a problem. What she was cold, and uncertain in a specific way she hadn't let herself be uncertain in a long time. She was thinking about her father's notebook, about whether the man who wrote it had been precise or only precise enough, and about the difference between those two things and what it would mean if she'd made an error in judgment that had just cost her everything she had left. She turned on the flashlight. She looked at the kudzu out the windshield. Then she turned it off and waited for morning, because that was the only productive thing she could do. She was out at first light with the notebook and a machete she'd bought at the farm supply in town. The kudzu did not part easily. It layered, old dead growth underneath, new growth on top, roots like cables running through the clay, and she cut for 2 hours and gained approximately 15 feet into the wall of it, which she understood was not the rate she needed, but also understood was the only rate available. She was thinking about a woman named Dorothy Beale. Beale ran a small livestock operation, 2 counties over, and had been her father's neighbor for about 6 years before Russell Ackley moved to Cullen County. Wren had visited twice as a child, and what she remembered clearly, the kind of clarity that attaches to things said by adults who don't condescend to children, was Beale standing at a fence in rubber boots saying, "A mule will always find water and will always find the easiest way between 2 points. You want to know what's on a piece of land, let a mule walk it first." Wren had not forgotten that. She'd filed it alongside everything else she'd learned in her father's company: patient, observational, unromantic knowledge about the physical world, and had carried it into a nursing career that used the same underlying skill. Look at what's there, not what you expect to be there. She called Beale that afternoon from the unmaintained road, standing in the gravel with kudzu pulp on her hands. Answered on the second ring. She had the voice of a woman who has not spent much of her life being surprised by things. "Wren Ackley," she said, not a question. "Yes, ma'am." "Your daddy's gone." Also not a question. "What are you calling me from a roadside for?" "I bought some land at the county tax sale, northeast corner of Cullen County, old quarry parcel. 41 acres, 40 years of kudzu bank to bank." The silence that followed had weight to it, the silence of someone working through an implication. "How much?" $2,400. "Cash?" "All of it." Made a sound, short, dry, a single syllable, that carried something that wasn't quite amusement but was close. Russell would have thought that was the right use of $2,400. It was the most generous thing anyone had said to Wren in 6 months. She moved past it quickly because she didn't have time to sit in it. "I remembered what you told me about mules." "I say a lot of things." "You meant that one." Another pause, longer. Was thinking, and Wren had learned as a child that Beale's silences were not empty and did not require filling. "My neighbor's got a mule he's been trying to rehome for 2 years, said finally. "Old gray thing, 20-something years old, sound as $1. His fence isn't worth keeping, and the mule gets out regular. Name's Burl Center, farms the Kettrick place on Route 17. That's right off your road, isn't it?" "About a half-mile south." "Go introduce yourself. Tell him I sent you, and get yourself a fence line before you do anything else, because a mule that gets out will keep getting out, and you want him getting out onto your land, and not into someone else's corn." "Yes, ma'am." "Your father kept that notebook current," said. "It wasn't a question. If he marked a water source on that parcel, it's there. Russell Ackley didn't write things down unless he was sure of them." Wren said nothing for a moment. "I needed to hear that." "I know you did," said and hung up. Burl Center was not easy to find. His house sat at the end of a lane behind a stand of white pines so thick you couldn't see the building from the road. She knocked on a Thursday morning and waited. He was a big man, late 60s, with hands that showed 40-some years of physical work, and a face that showed he'd learned to size people up quickly and didn't apologize for doing it. He looked at her for a long moment when she gave her name. "Russell Ackley's girl," he said. "Yes, sir. Your daddy surveyed the back line of my property back in '09. Came out in February, coldest week of the year. Said he'd have the numbers to me by end of month. He studied her, had them to me in 9 days. She told him what she was doing. She told him about the parcel, the kudzu, her father's notebook, and what she understood about the perched water table. She told him she'd like to use the mule on the land if he'd let it, that she'd fence a line for him first. He listened the way her father used to listen, without interrupting, without his face doing things it wasn't asked to do. When she finished, he turned his coffee cup in his hands twice. "That mule's been going through my fence on the north side for 4 years," he said. "Every time I patch it, he finds another way through. I thought he was going after the fescue in the lower field, but the lower field's on the south end." He set the cup down. "He's been going north, every time, and I never followed him far enough to know where he was going." He helped her run a temporary fence line the following Saturday. 2 hours in the cold, Wren driving posts, while Burl stretched wire, the two of them working in the efficient quiet of people who don't need to discuss what they're doing, because they can both see it. When they were done, he went to his barn and led the mule out on a rope halter. The animal was gray going to white at the muzzle, with the settled, deliberate movement of something that has long since stopped being hurried by anyone. He looked at Wren for a moment. Then he walked to the new fence line, stepped through the gap in the temporary gate, and moved north into the kudzu without further instruction. "Well," Burl said. "Yeah," Wren said. She spent the next 3 weeks clearing and fencing, following the paths the mule opened by moving through the kudzu at its own pace and in its own direction. She slept in her car for the first week, then in a second-hand tent she bought in town, and then in a small camp trailer. She traded 3 weeks of fence-mending labor for with a man on the county road who'd been meaning to sell it for 2 years. By the end of the 3rd week, she had running water from a creek she'd uncovered in the east draw, and 40 feet of cleared path snaking northwest into the interior of the property, along whatever route the mule had decided mattered. She also had a buyer for dried kudzu vine starch. This was the part she hadn't mentioned to anyone, including Burl, because it sounded stranger before the numbers materialized than after. Kudzu root starch, processed from the vine's root system, sold commercially to health food suppliers and specialty distributors for cooking applications. The root systems on her land were 40 years deep and enormous. She'd researched processing requirements on her phone in the tent at night and found a cooperative in North Carolina that sourced from independent producers. The conversation with their buyer had taken 12 minutes and ended with a price per pound that made her sit very still doing arithmetic. It wasn't enough to solve her problems. It was enough to be a direction. It was Burl who told her about a man named Aldous Fry. Aldous Fry was 73 years old, had farmed the valley floor 2 miles east of her parcel for most of his life before his knees gave out, and had spent the last 4 years in a house at the edge of his former farmland, watching things on the hillsides he no longer had the range to reach. He knew the northeast corner of the county, the way people who have walked every inch of a place for 60 years know it, not from maps, but in the way you know the layout of your own kitchen in the dark. Wren drove out on a Thursday afternoon and knocked on his door. He answered in the time it takes a man with bad knees to cross a living room. He was shorter than she'd expected, with white hair and the careful stillness of someone who has learned that every movement costs something and therefore means something. "I know who you are," he said before she gave her name. "You bought the Dunbar parcel." "Yes, sir." "Come in and sit down." He had photographs on his walls, black and white ones, of the valley in years so far back that the hillsides were clear. She could see the shale outcroppings on the northeast ridge unobstructed by any vine. "There's no water marked on the county plat for that parcel," she said. "No." He sat across from her. The plat was drawn in 1962 and the spring had already been covered by then. The old Dunbar family stopped farming the upper section in the 50s, and what grows fast on shale grows fast. He paused. "Your father knew about the spring." "His notebook has it." Aldous studied her. Russell was precise. He said it the way you'd say something that needed no support. "There's a structure up there, too. You'll find it before you find the water, probably." She waited. Built in the late 1800s, the original family, a spring house, stone, set into the hillside above the spring. They built it for cold storage. The water comes up through the rock at temperature year-round, 40-some degrees, and the structure sits over top of it, keeps the air inside cold. They used it like a refrigerator for 100 years. He paused. Then the kudzu came, and nobody went up there anymore, and after a while, nobody remembered to go. Is it intact? Stone doesn't go anywhere, he said. If the hillside didn't shift, it's there. He told her other things, the soil composition in the lower draw, the way the shale ridgeline acted as a natural windbreak for the south-facing slope below it, the fact that the national forest boundary ran along her north property line, and that the 280 acres of Forest Service land behind her parcel had no maintained road access. The only practical crossing point for any kind of vehicle was a low-water ford at the base of the east draw, which was on her land. You understand what that means, he said. She'd already understood it. She'd been sitting with it for 2 weeks since she found the ford marked in her father's notebook. Whoever controls the crossing controls access to 280 acres of landlocked timber, she said. Aldous looked at her with the expression of someone who has been waiting to see how long it would take a person to arrive at something. A man named Quentin Rail has been in this county since March, he said. He comes from Charlotte, buys land and holds it or develops it, depending. He bought 3 properties on the South Road this year. He paused. He's been asking questions about the northeast corner for 2 months. He doesn't know about the spring house. I don't believe he knows about the ford precisely, but he has people who look into things. Wren sat with that. You need to move faster than you probably planned, Aldous said. I know, she said. I've been moving. He looked at her steadily. Come back Saturday, he said. I know where my son left his brush saw. I can't run it myself anymore, but I can tell you where the spring house is going to be from memory inside 40 feet. She came back Saturday. The mule found the spring house first. She was moving the old animal through the northwest section on a Tuesday in late October, following the path he'd been opening over 6 weeks of patient wandering, when he stepped off the cleared ground onto something, and the sound changed. Not loud, a low, dense, carried note, like a footfall on hollow ground rather than clay. The mule stopped. He looked down at what he was standing on. Then he stepped forward, and the note came again, slightly different in pitch. Wren crouched. She could see, between the ground-level kudzu stems, she hadn't cleared yet, a surface that was not earth and not shale. Cut stone, placed deliberately, with the close, tight fitting of work done by people who understood that the structure would have to outlast them. She could see 3 courses of it before the kudzu growth closed off the view. She stood up slowly. She was not conscious of holding her breath until she let it out. She took her phone out and called Aldous Fry. It's here, she said when he picked up. A pause, a long one, and in that pause something she hadn't heard from him in either of their conversations. A quality of relief, the sound of someone who has been keeping a particular thought at bay for a long time, and has just been told they can stop. Where exactly, he said. Northwest section, about 60 feet past the cedar cluster you told me about. The mule found it. The mule found it. He was quiet for a moment. Don't do anything until I get there. I'm going to start clearing around it today, she said. Don't do anything stupid. I was an ER nurse for 5 years, she said. He made a sound. That's not the same thing. I know. I'll be careful anyway. She spent 4 hours that afternoon removing kudzu from around the structure, cutting at the base and stacking material away from the stone, letting the light come in from the edges the way Aldous had told her. What the light found as it came in was extraordinary in the specific way of things that have been sealed away and not changed. The spring house was 12 feet wide and 9 feet deep, set into the north face of the shale ridge with its back wall, the living rock of the hillside. The stone was dry-laid granite, fitted without mortar, with the same close precision as the old road bridges she'd seen in photographs of the county. The interior was cold in the way of spaces connected to the Earth's temperature rather than the air's, and from somewhere in the back, below a flat capstone at floor level, she could hear water, moving water, steady and unremarkable, the sound of something that had been there all along and didn't need to announce itself. She took photographs. She sent one to Aldous without caption. She sent one to Dot Beale. Dot responded in 4 minutes. Your daddy found this on a map. Glad somebody went looking. She didn't respond right away. She sat on the stone threshold with her back to the cool air coming out of the spring house and looked at the kudzu she'd cleared, at the sky above the shale ridge, at the late October light going gold across the hillside. Then she went to move the mule before he got into the lower fence again. Quinton Rail arrived on a November Thursday in a dark blue SUV with a Charlotte plate. He knocked on the trailer door, and when she opened it, he offered his card with the ease of a man who has done that gesture many thousands of times. He was medium height, well-dressed without being showy, with the calibrated neutrality of someone who has learned not to let his face cost him anything. She looked at the card. She didn't take it. "I know who you are, Mr. Rail," she said. "Come in." He came in. He sat across from her at the small table where her father's notebook lay open alongside the county plat map. He looked at the plat map, and she watched him understand immediately that she had done the same work he had. Something shifted in his expression, small, quick, recalibrated. "I'll be direct," he said. "I have an interest in the Forest Service land on your north boundary. I understand the ford crossing on your east draw may be the only viable vehicle access to that parcel, and I'd like to discuss an arrangement." "What kind of arrangement?" He named a number, $47,000 for the crossing corridor and an easement, or the parcel entire. It was more money than Wren had held in her hands at any point in her life. She felt it land, felt the pull of it, the way real numbers have mass when they're placed in front of real need. She did not let that show. "What's the timber value on 280 landlocked acres?" she said. A brief pause. "That's a complex assessment." "Estimate," she said. "You've had it assessed, or you wouldn't be here." Something shifted in his expression, small, recalibrated. With access, mature timber on 280 acres runs between $600,000 and $1 million at current prices. "And you're offering me $47,000 for the access that makes that possible." "I'm offering fair value for what you currently have, which is a small parcel in early recovery with a crossing point." "What I currently have," Wren said, "is the only ford crossing over that creek for 4 miles in either direction, a deed verified by the county assessor, a spring house that is intact and actively producing cold water year-round, and an attorney in Abingdon who finds my situation interesting." She had called the attorney 2 days after Aldous first mentioned Rail. The attorney had said, "Send me the plat map and your father's notebook pages. I'll call you Thursday." Rail looked at her. "You're prepared." "I've been clearing kudzu by hand for 2 months," she said. "Preparation is how I spend my time." He picked his card up from the edge of the table where she'd set it. He looked at it. He set it back down. "I'll be in touch," he said. "I expect you will," she said, and watched him drive away. The winter that came in January came hard. It came the way bad winters come in the Appalachian valleys, not with one storm, but with a sequence of them, each driving deeper into the ground temperature, until by the second week of January, the creek in the east draw was solid, and the county road had been passable and not passable 3 times in 9 days. The farms in the valley below the ridge were making calculations about feed, about water, about livestock that had been straightforward in September and were not straightforward now. Wren noticed the cold through the spring house first. The air coming out of it didn't change. 43 degrees, the same as October because it was connected to the Earth's stored temperature and not the air's. She'd run a pipe from the capstone outflow to a trough she'd built in the cleared area below the structure, and the water in the trough was liquid when everything around it was not. Burl Center's cattle needed water by the second week of January. His primary tank heater had failed in the first hard freeze, and his backup had gone solid. He had 61 head and 3 weeks of winter still probable in the forecast. He came to her fence line on a Wednesday morning. He came alone, and he looked like a man who hadn't been sleeping well, which for Burl Center was a visible thing, because he was not a man who showed much. "Your spring's holding," he said. "It hasn't dropped," she said. He put his hands on the fence rail and looked at the trough. He was carrying something and working out how to set it down. "I know what I'm asking," he said. "You fix my fence and you lent me your mule," she said. "Where would you bring them in?" He blinked once, just slightly, adjusting to an answer he'd prepared himself not to receive. "Through the east gap," he said, "along the cleared section to the trough." I'll need you to rotate them so they're not hitting the same ground twice, she said. But you know that. I know that, he said. He brought the first group Thursday morning, and she spent the day managing the rotation. By the end of the second week, she was carrying water through a gravity-fed line to a second trough she'd rigged from salvage pipe, supporting Burl's cattle and a smaller herd belonging to a family named Ostrander, whose well had dropped below usable on the 15th of January. She was sleeping 5 hours a night, eating when she thought of it, and keeping a hand-drawn schedule on the trailer wall she updated twice a day. Dale Pickett came to her fence on a Friday in the third week of January. He came in his county truck, and he stood at the fence line without coming through, which told her something about how he'd decided to approach this. The practiced ease she'd seen in the courthouse was not entirely present today. "Heard you've been carrying water for half the county," he said. "3 operations," she said. "That's not half." He looked at the trough. "My wife's brother runs a small cow-calf operation on the back road, about 40 head. He stopped. His pond's solid and his well's at 9 feet. He's been trying to truck water in, but the roads." He stopped again, looking somewhere past her left shoulder. "He's too proud to ask anybody for anything." "Tell him to call me," she said, "tonight if he can." Dale Pickett looked at her directly then. He looked at her the way he had not looked at her in the county courthouse, and what was in his face was not the same thing that had been in it then. It wasn't gratitude. It was something heavier and more complicated, something that had the weight of recognizing a mistake in it. "You know I wasn't kind to you in that auction room," he said. "No," she said, "you weren't." He took that without arguing it. "Thank you," he said. "It came out rough, like the words had been stored somewhere they didn't quite fit." "Keep your brother-in-law's cattle alive," she said. "That's all." He got back in his truck and drove away. She turned back toward the south gate because there were trough levels to check and the Ostrander animals to account for, and she was not going to spend more of her attention on Dale Pickett than he'd already taken. Quinton Rail came back in March, 10 days after the last ice broke and the county road stayed passable. He came slower this time. He got out without his card ready, which was different, and he stood by the vehicle and waited for her to walk to him, which told her his calculation had shifted, before he said a word. "I've been watching what you did this winter," he said. 5 operations. "The Ostranders and Burl and 3 others," she said. "The last one was a family on the back road with a kitchen garden and a pump that froze in December. They just needed water." He looked at the cleared land around her, at the path leading toward the spring house, at the trough still running clear in the March cold. "I'd like to propose a legitimate easement arrangement," he said. "Not a purchase. A negotiated easement, rate assessed independently. I'm prepared to fund a structural assessment of the spring house at my own cost." She looked at him. She had prepared herself for several versions of Quinton Rail, the one who came back with lawyers, the one with a sharper number and sharper edges. She had not prepared for this version. "My attorney in Abingdon will need to be part of that conversation," she said. "I assumed as much. And I want a creek impact provision on any harvest activity on the forest parcel. That's reasonable." She put her hand out. He shook it. It was not friendship. It was 2 people who had been on opposite sides of something acknowledging that the thing between them had changed enough to make other arrangements possible. "Call my attorney's office," she said. "She'll tell you what she needs to start." The county assessor's revised estimate arrived in April. She opened it standing in the trailer doorway in the morning cold, still in her work jacket from checking the trough. The per-acre value had been revised upward based on documented water resources. The formally registered historic structure, the county landmark office, had sent a separate letter about the spring house 2 weeks earlier, which she'd read twice and pinned to the trailer wall, the established access point to adjacent federal land, and the recorded agricultural production from the Kudzu starch operation. 41 acres. She did the arithmetic standing in the door. Then she sat down on the step, because her legs made that decision without consulting her. She thought about her father. Not the grief of him, which had become something she carried rather than something that stopped her, but the specific image of him at the kitchen table in the Barrow Roadhouse, with his notebook open, explaining to her at age 11 why surveyors marked water sources, even when nobody asked for them, because water was the thing that determined what land could become. And most people only thought about what land looked like right now. She had not known, sitting in that auction room with her envelope, what the land was going to become. She had known the water was there, and she had known the land had been written off without looking, and she had known those two things together were worth $2,400 she did not have to spare. That was the extent of her certainty. The land had taught her the rest. Burl came out on a Saturday in May with a flat of pepper seedlings he'd started from seed, set them on the trailer step without a word, and said she had good southern exposure on the lower cleared section that was going to waste. She planted them the following Tuesday with Aldous Fry's instructions in her ear over the phone, her knees in the soft clay soil of the lower draw, the mule watching from the fence line, with the detached professional interest of an animal that had already identified the most useful path through this land and was waiting patiently for the rest of them to catch up. The pepper plants went in the ground. The springhouse ran cold and clear behind her up the hill. Somewhere in the shale above, her father's notebook had predicted all of it, in the plain handwriting of a man who had walked this county in every season and written down what he found, not because anyone asked him to, but because he believed that precision was a form of care, and care was the only thing that lasted. She had bought 41 acres of kudzu and collapsed rock for $2,400, and she had gone back to it every morning, and she had refused to stop until it showed her what it was. It had shown her. Everything else had followed from that.